episode of Evolution Hour. I'll get the title readjusted. It's still up the material from last week. I'll have to correct that when I get the thing going, but we're going with the length of it. Continuing on with our deliriously fascinating instrument of torture, the get rid of a stupid upgrade, get rid of that. Okay, let me get over to here, see if we got any stuff on there. Everyone hopefully can see our patrons who are helping the old RJ muddle along week by week, up and down, in and out, over, under, around, and through, and they'll remove that. And then there's my mug so we can kind of see a little bit more what's going on. We're still in this zone that's running on for pages and pages and pages of good old Jeanson trying to repeat the same thing over and over and over and over again. So we've got our latest batch, which is the squirrels and chipmunks, the Sciuridae, which is kind of funky. He's got maybe 30 dots on here coming in from basically the flood down to maybe 600 BC. Well, I don't think that's going to be cutting it. Needless to say, there were no technical sources in his reference bibliography that refer to any of that. But in fact, there's an awful lot. And as it happens, some of the awful lot from Jack Sullivan I bumped into because he is one of the researchers on Pacific Northwest chipmunks and delivered a really wonderful Darwin Day lecture out at Eastern Washington University, my alma mater here in Washington. On the various work that they've been going on for years and years and years and years and years. And so we'll be putting up a couple of the papers, one from 2008 that he wrote with Good, and then one in 2012 by Reed that puts the stuff in perspective as to how they're dealing with the interconnection between the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA as to how this creates a dynamic of hybridization zones in these little demes and avatars and subpopulations of chipmunks. And some of this stuff is material that clearly had to have occurred millions of years ago in some of these earlier developments. There's also, as you might be guessing, there's some genetics. And there's a paper from 2014 from Redlesberger on endogenous retroviruses in squirrels and how that's related to particular clades. And of course, there are fossils. There's one that I've put up from 2017 by Fairman, which is including the DNA of the thing from a 30,000-year-old Siberian fossil. So squirrels and chipmunks get around. They gotten all over the place, all the way to the Pacific Northwest, all the way to Siberia, etc., etc. All of this since the flood. How absolutely amazing. And how much of the stuff must he be leaving out? The part two relates to a piece by Gavin Cox from creation.com that it's just a shorty. But what amused me about it is they're going after Francis Collins and Richard Dawkins, who apparently did a little chit-chat on a video recently, and that just didn't please Gavin Cox at all. But along the way, he waves John Sanford's Genetic Entropy as if it were a thing. No matter how you try to wriggle around that, it's not going to become a thing. So our weather's kind of cool down here in Spokane nicely. We're hopefully going to back more into actual like October weather fairly soon. Not nearly as messy as some of these little places where they're still getting some heat waves and things are going along in terrible places with floods going on in other countries and droughts, etc., etc. So we can hardly complain about the fact that our weather has been bumping along in the 70s on that. I'm not seeing anyone in the chat department, so I'm not sure whether or not anybody is cooked in onto this one. Maybe they didn't realize I'd be on at the right time for a change, but there we go. The major task that I'm doing right at the moment is plowing through a mass of back issues of the Institute for Creation Research Acts and Facts, which is going to be going into volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. Some of the stuff relates to material that's already being discussed in the 2 chapters that I'm mainly doing, and also material like this that's going to end up with a discussion in the Ark Encounter appendix that's going in the new book. And the other masses of it relate to cosmology issues. It's a relentless drumbeat that Jason Lyle does about the solar system and the various planets, supposedly from a creationist point of view. He doesn't really cite many creationists in it, and he doesn't cite much in the way of technical literature. It's all just kind of a gee whiz. Here's the facts of the solar system. Oh gosh, this is bespeaking of the creator, and that's about as far as it goes. So it's an interesting litany that goes on there. Hello, Barbara Arnzen. Hi, Barbara. Listening for the most part. Yeah. The Acts and Facts was effectively a monthly magazine, but it looks like they're kind of slipping as we're entering the modern era. And so the stuff from like 2020 on are often only bi-monthly, which suggests that they're maybe running out of steam financially. We'll see how that works out. And this process may continue to where in another 5 or 10 years, maybe Acts and Facts will be out like quarterly. Who knows? What the circumstances are. It still looks very glossy. They're very good on the graphics. The same thing that happens at Answers in Genesis. I mean, you can't fault them for the beautiful pictures they do, the high quality photography, the graphics. It all looks really razzle dazzle fancy. And anybody that was subscribed to them, and you can get them all online for free. I mean, you can download the PDFs and all that. I think the current issue may not be instantly available, but after a while you can get them open access. And most, not all, but most of the creationist literature, the Creation Science Quarterly, the back issues of the various Answers in Genesis journals, of which some end up over at creation.com because they had their little split back in the early 2000s with CMI over Ham's fiddly bits with the finances. That most of that stuff will be available. Not all the back issues of Creation magazine, but most of them are accessible. And some of the more obscure little things, the origins research stuff from the British creationists, there's a bunch of little minor journals. There may be 6 or 8 journals, some of which are fairly technical, and some of them are more just general glossy magazines that in one form or another kind of dominated the field. At the moment, for the technical end of creationism, you've got the Answers Research Journal, and you have the Journal of Creation, which is also an offshoot of that Answers in Genesis cluster. And you find an awful lot of the names cycling back and forth between the two. And they look really fancy articles. They've got lots of footnotes. The graphic style often resembles regular journals by deliberate choice, so that they look really, really professional, and they have graphs and all that stuff in the same way that Jeanson's book has all of that. But pay attention to the footnotes, kids, and look up the references and find out what's actually going on. So all of that stuff will be cycled along, and hopefully by the time we are knee deep into working out the remaining chapters from Jackson's end, when we get all that coordinated in, then I've also got a massive stuff downstairs that relates to the geology material. There's all that delicious stuff that I want to work in somehow or other from Nick Zentner and the geology of the Pacific Northwest, with all of these exotic terrains in that just is inexplicable from a flood geology context. It's absolutely nonsensical. And then there's a lot of material on plants and genetic material that as necessary, when we go through and we have the finished text organized, we'll see how much of that stuff is logical to put it in as references. There may be some additional info boxes on that, because there's just so much material that we had to leave out of volume 1, even though we were bringing up a lot of the material on that. So all that stuff is going to go along. You can see over there the edge of the new editions of the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. I may as well wave that in front of everyone so everyone can see. Isn't that pretty? That's our second book. The second adventure as the story continues. And I'm already working on the third novel, which is the other half of the second novel that is taking place over the same time frame. And it'll be interesting because it involves pulling that chronology out. And so part of my little brain is still doing research on sidebar material, like how do you get to Amsterdam from London in the 1870s when they need to have a visit there? Turns out it wasn't as easy as you'd think. I think poor old Fogg will have to take a boat from Harwich over to Rotterdam, and then take the new railway line from Rotterdam to Amsterdam, and that'll get him up there in 1879. But this is all very, very fun. It was kind of funky because there was a wackaloon creationist that we were watching on the movie night that Sci Strike Sister runs, Sci Sister, every not every Saturday, but pretty much. And this was this silly little person who believes in that there was this gigantic mud flood that took place that wiped out civilization. And we're not talking the biblical flood here. We're talking about stuff that Victorian London is actually an ancient prehistoric settlement that was destroyed and then expropriated, so that stuff from the Crystal Palace wasn't actually built in the 1850s, according to him, but was dredged up from this antediluvian pre-mud flood civilization. And then all of the alleged history about all of that is just made up out of thin air. He's a flat earther. I mean, he has just a pile up of absolute claptrap. But those will be sort of representing the kind of people who effectively shred everything and know nothing about anything. It was fun for me to watch because my brain is parked partly in the 19th century because of the Fogg novels, plus all the research that I had done on an old storyline done that was set in the 19th century, a big family epic. So all of that period is extremely well known to me about what London looked like and how it changed over time, and what Paris and New York City and San Francisco and all these other places have done. So the idea that he's got this catastrophic but vague cataclysm that had taken place there is superficially preposterous, but is no different in kind than what creationists are doing with the big flood, because they're also shredding the historical information, shredding the archaeological information, failing to really work out what they think happened. It's not quite so ostentatiously obvious because the archaeological record, by definition, is less intense when you are talking about something in the 2500 BC period. So there's lots of places that aren't documented by written texts. You have archaeological spots where you might have something in one location and then another thing then from 300 years later, and maybe hundreds of miles away. All of that makes it easier for them to slide that in. But there's still way too much information, which we're going to be going into in delicious detail in the new book, on why none of that's going to work. So there's going to be much more archaeology in the new volume than there was in the first. There's still going to be quite a lot of geological information that will be particularly popping up later on, because we're going to be discussing, there are weird ideas about plate tectonics and the Cambrian explosion and the Grand Canyon and the geology of that period. So much of that has stuff that goes back into the Precambrian, and then upper edges of it are in the time of the dinosaurs. There's just lots and lots and lots of stuff going on. So it's fun to kind of piece it all together and get it structured so that it'll flow together as a nice, smooth narrative. And we'll make up all the little pieces on that. Everybody keep in touch in terms of any topics. I think we've got a pretty good listing. There's several creationist compendiums of the evidence against evolution, the lists of things that they consider absolutely disastrous for evolution. And there's stuff at AIG, there's stuff at ICR and others, and there's a certain repetition to the thing. But we're going to be making a point to pick off all of the instances of what they consider the smoking guns against the conventional scientific view of things. We alluded to some of it in volume 1 of The Rocks Were There, but we'll pick off the remainder of them. So some of the stuff involves of the solar system, magnetic fields of planets, magnetic reversals, the origin of solar systems, the stars, nuclear formation of elements, and all that stuff. So there's going to be a lot of what we hope are the current up-to-date scientific information on that. The big star of the show, of course, will be the just relentless criticism that creationists do about the Big Bang. And the Big Bang is a useful benchmark if you're trying to separate intelligent design advocates and old Earth creationists from young Earth creationists. Whereas you can find a lot of instances of where superficially the discussion that an anti-evolutionist will be presenting on the Cambrian explosion or the origin of information and that sort of stuff will be remarkably similar regardless of whether they think the Earth is 6,000 years old or not. And that's why somebody like John Sanford and Nathaniel Jeanson in their books can be folded into Jeffrey Tompkins and others into the intelligent design framework, because they're all able to argue things that are not really connected specifically to chronology. But for all practical purposes, I can't think of anybody apart from weird David Berlinski, who kind of blathers on about stuff, in the intelligent design movement who's critical of the Big Bang, because that's, from the old Earth creationist perspective, their smoking gun, as here was the creation ex nihilo. We've got Genesis nailed down. Never mind all the fiddly bits that the creationists talk about. We've got that part. So the fact that instead of trying to find some way of rearranging their system, hello, Command Cyborg, hello, world. Instead of trying to somehow tweak some of these features and incorporate the Big Bang, they could speed up the Big Bang. In principle, you could have a Big Bang only a few thousand years ago, and then you stretch the heavens out instantaneously, because a lot of creationist cosmology comes into that framework. So what they're objecting to is the Big Bang was 13 billion years ago. And so far, I don't see any immediate tendency from some of the edges of the creationist cosmology to be ready to adopt a recent Big Bang model. But in principle, since they can fudge anything, look at Nathaniel Jeanson squeaking around with the squirrels, there's be nothing in principle, provided they try to resolve how you could get stars so quickly, et cetera, and so on. But they have to do that anyway. I mean, they have all of the universe being made in only 6,000 years. So why are they having such a big trouble with the Big Bang? In part, I suspect it's because there's so much about that Big Bang cosmology that naturally involves slow formation of elements. That you have a sequential circumstance where the elements that we find inside of our body are produced in a bunch of different star systems over a very long period of time. All of the hydrogen in us, all the water that we would have, the hydrogen in that is from the Big Bang. It's so every one of us has pieces that are 13.8 billion years old. But oxygen and carbon and all these other ones are way, way later, formed in main sequence stars and in supernovas. There's a whole complex process on that. And you can see kind of a teetering backpedal of the apologetics as they've had to try to deal with the fact that the regular cosmologists have been working out more and more details about how all of that process works. A counterpart of that is going to show up in another book that Jackson and I will be writing a little bit later on, which will go into like the weird conspiracy thinking that people have and anti-vax views and all of that. And flat Earth will be in that part, and also climate science denialism. And Potholer 54 had just done a recent video that connects up with the research that I'm keeping track of on that topic, where he's showing how the climate science denialists have been evolving in the last few years to pretty much start accepting things that they were saying was impossible a while back. So exactly the same signatories who were insisting that CO2 doesn't have any effect at all on the temperature of the planet now have pretty much accepted that. And now they're saying, well, it's a nice thing because it's going to be great for the plants. So stop complaining. And so many of the things that they were trying to argue, Potholer would cite their original works where they were saying the one thing, and now, whoops, show them not taking that position and basically admitting the opposite of what they were doing. You get a little bit of that in creationism, where Nathaniel Jeanson dropped a shoe a few years back where he said, well, of course we accept transitional forms. Really? And then there's the big fracas going on over whether or not catastrophic plate tectonics is real or not, whether or not natural selection is real. Randy Gugliuzza, who's now the main editor at Acts and Facts, is steadfastly an opponent of natural selection. And in fact, one, I think it was either Tompkins or Jeanson that basically said, bye. from ICR because he can't buy into that. Or maybe it was Jason Lyle, as a matter of fact. Yes, I think one of the, who's not actually a geneticist. But so you get bits and pieces of those things. Plate tectonics was a thing that wasn't accepted by creationists in the 1960s and 70s. Now it's part and parcel. They've got stuff moving ridiculously fast. The entire Alps rammed up in the course of a few months, according to some of their view, and then turning into stone really, really quickly. And then the super fast ice age comes along and carves all of this stuff out. We're talking about literally only a few years of stuff, 100 years at the most. It's hilarious to kind of see all that stuff. We'll be alluding to that. Another feature that distinguishes the young Earth creationists is that they will insist there was one ice age, which means they must in principle deny any evidence of any ice age in periods predating the Pleistocene, or anything that looks like an ice age stuff has to be dragged into that post-flood ice age that they have. There's stuff at the south of India that was a glaciation thing when India was parked down in the southern hemisphere back in the Silurian. That's hundreds of millions of years ago. And then there was also a lot of evidence of Precambrian ice ages, which is in that perfect world that was in that little blob from the created stuff. Then Adam and Eve end up in there, and then maybe, I don't know, a month or two after arriving in Eden, they're sinning, and then they're expelled and all that. The chronology is extremely vague in Genesis about this, but it's entirely possible that Adam and Eve only spent a month, a week in Eden before screwing things up. So this is like opening up Disneyland and having the pieces fall off after a month. I mean, this is really bad planning going on all the way up and down. But chronology has never been a clear detail in this area, and it's a thing that young Earth creationists like to think the Bible is more lofty in this. They're to some extent more conservative than a lot of their cultural contemporaries. They tended to keep their numbers kind of compact, although they're often numerological variations on 7 and 60s, and there are multiples of stuff going on. If you look at the ages, how they round out of the various patriarchs, they have these oddly symmetrical ages where it's multiples of certain numbers, and it's ending in 5s a lot and all that. Very, very peculiar, which suggests a lot of fiddling. And these may be them thinking in terms of groups of people, or they're just making shit up. But to be fair, your Babylonians and others would go way bigger. So they would just go hog wild. Once they figured out how to write big numbers, they would have kings that lived for 60,000 years. I mean, they just go berserk on it. And over in India, when they figured out how to do zeros, they would go even farther. And so they actually do talk about millions of years or even billions of years, because, you could just add a few more zeros. Boop, 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 boop. The gods can do all sorts of fun stuff. Try to work out any details on that, you get into a great deal of trouble. In the Western context, that long-term chronology thing comes in very rarely. I think there was a medieval Jewish writer who kind of speculated that the 1,000 years is to God like a day kind of a thing could come up with ways to generate millions or even billions of years that route. But he was not terribly popular. And it certainly wasn't the common view when you got down into the 1600s, when Bishop Ussher and other people are calculating when the earth was made and when Adam lived and all this. They were trying to be sciencey, but they all came up with a variety of data. And that's another one you definitely, if you bump into a young Earth creationist who thinks that it's a settled thing as to, 2348 BC, that was when the flood took place. It's quite clearly calculated by one or two people. Yeah, but depends on which text you use, which translations, which patriarchs you add up. And this is amply demonstrated by just the astonishing range of dates for the creation of the earth, but the people using the same texts. And this doesn't get noted much by the doctrinal people you see at ICR and AIG. They just pretend as if there's just this one little version from Bishop Ussher. And we'll be going into all of that aspect in a really juicy little info box in the new book. So anyway, that kind of gets everybody up to speed on what's happening on things. The next weeks, I'm sure they'll also be presenting stuff that I'm gleaning from these back issues of Acts and Facts. And then we'll be continuing through the stupid charts for good old Jeanson. A thing that everybody keep an eye out for, and I've not seen any sign of it yet, but the mythic paper that Gunter Beckley is supposedly going to be doing with Ann Gager and a few other authors, unclear, Hustler, I think his name is another one of the people doing this, on whale evolution and how impossible it all is. This, when I heard about it, I think it was earlier in the year, maybe even last year, but certainly it's been quite a ways ago during the pandemic. But Gutsick Gibbon Erica had caught wind of it, and it came up in a discussion that she had when she interviewed Beckley on her channel. And supposedly they're doing this paper that's going to be going into great detail on why whale evolution is a crock. And I am really looking forward to that, and to see how much of this connects up with von Sternberg and his notions, because he, in the intelligent design community, was basically point guy for the claims that there were serious troubles with whale evolution. You get sections of it reflected and repeated by Casey Luskin and all of that stuff. But Sternberg was going around giving lectures about this stuff and putting up his little PowerPoints, but no references. And as you know, from a source methods point of view, until you get a reference bibliography and source citations, claim 1, source X, so that you can see what's actually being claimed, and do they provide evidence for every claim, and how much of the literature are they bumping into, and how much are they leaving out, and how dated is this stuff, etc., etc. You can't figure that out from bloody PowerPoint. You got to have that solid material. So how much of that's going to end up in Beckley's paper, if and when it eventually appears, I presume in Biocomplexity, or maybe one of the little in-house journals. They publish stuff that are kind of pay-for-play kind of science magazines that have been an outlet for some intelligent design, and to some extent some young Earth creationist material as well lately. And we'll be alluding to those little bits in the new book. So anyway, that kind of gets everybody up to speed on everything. Try to weather the storm on climate. The elections are coming up. We still got little dregs of COVID. We've got monkeypox. We've got the new right-wingers in Sweden and Italy. We've got Putin doing bridge repair work over in Ukraine. We've got North Korea lobbing missiles across Japan. We've got the Chinese glowering at Taiwan. What a calm and serene world we are living in. So hopefully we'll not be blown to smithereens next week and the week after that. I got a good half hour of material in on everything. Everybody stay safe. Don't accept any wooden penguins. And hopefully we'll be able to see you next week, kids. And we will end our stream now.